In the quiet early hours of June 15th, 2008, a train thundered down the tracks in Brielle, New Jersey, only to be met with a terrifying sight: a young woman on the rails. The impact was instantly fatal, and a tragedy unfolded in this Jersey Shore town. When the sun rose, authorities were left with a haunting question: who was she? Over 17 years have passed since that night, yet the woman struck by the New Jersey Transit train remains unidentified. Dubbed the Monmouth County Jane Doe, her case has become one of New Jersey's enduring mysteries. Shortly after 1:30 a.m. on June 15th, 2008, police were alerted that a pedestrian had been hit by a train near the Fisk Avenue crossing in Brielle. The location was just south of the Manasquan station, along a stretch of track bordering a residential area. The victim was pronounced dead at the scene, a white female with no identification on her. Investigators couldn't immediately determine if this was a horrific accident or whether the entire thing was intentional, as there were no witnesses aside from the train crew. What they did know was that the young woman's life had ended on the tracks that rainy night, and no one stepped forward to claim her in the aftermath. Over the following days, an autopsy and forensic examination were conducted. Despite the violent nature of the incident, the woman's face was completely recognizable, which gave hope that someone might identify her quickly. Authorities circulated sketches and descriptions to the public, hoping a friend or family member might recognize the young woman. Despite this, though, absolutely no one came forward. Investigators carefully documented the Jane Doe's physical characteristics and belongings, piecing together clues about her life. She was estimated to be somewhere between her late teens and late 20s. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed roughly 120 pounds, and had neck-length brown hair and blue-gray eyes. She also had a distinctive scar indicating that she underwent an appendectomy surgery. However, due to the extreme force of the collision, it wasn't clear whether there were other distinctive marks which were missed. Crucially, what the Jane Doe was wearing and carrying provided a vivid snapshot of her circumstances. She was dressed in multiple layers, possibly for warmth, or possibly because she was homeless or living a transient lifestyle. But more on that in a moment. Around her neck, she had a blue rosary-style bead necklace with a cross pendant, and on her wrist, she was wearing a wooden bracelet featuring images of Catholic saints. Unless this was a gift from a friend, this narrows down her identity somewhat. Most intriguingly, the Jane Doe had a brown tote bag with her, emblazoned with the words, New York. Inside this bag was an assortment of personal belongings, almost like a travel kit or a mobile wardrobe, which offers a poignant glimpse into her life. Personally, I think that based on the evidence as it stands, there's virtually no chance that she wasn't homeless. That said, I suppose she could have also been hitchhiking, but I don't think people really did that in 2008. But feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. She had no form of identification, no phone, no wallet on her, just these personal items. To investigators, this raised the likelihood that she was far from home and estranged from people who would immediately miss her. As of 2025, it's reported that the Monmouth County Jane Doe's case is undergoing forensic genetic genealogy testing. This means that unless she was adopted, the authorities should now be able to resolve her case in the near future and restore her identity. As for whether she did this act herself or whether she was a victim of an accident, this too also remains unsolved. Some have speculated that given that she was likely a practicing Catholic, that this may have been accidental, or at least staged by her to look accidental. In late October 2004, construction workers clearing an old racetrack in New Jersey made a grim discovery: the skeletal remains of a young woman. The location was the former Malibu Grand Prix go-kart track in Mount Laurel, Burlington County, a once bustling entertainment center abandoned for years. To this day, the victim's identity remains unknown, and she is remembered only as the Burlington County Jane Doe. Now, over 2 decades later, a cutting-edge DNA breakthrough revealing Turkic ancestry has injected new hope into this cold case. On October 26, 2004, an excavation crew was demolishing structures at the Malibu Grand Prix site when they stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area off Fellowship Road. The property, once a go-kart racing park with arcades, had sat vacant for the previous 6 years. Hidden among overgrown brush and debris lay the skeletal remains of a female, later estimated to have been deceased for roughly 1 year. Cops believe she likely died in early 2003, meaning her remains had quietly weathered at least a full cycle of seasons before discovery. Investigators immediately treated the scene with suspicion, and finding a body in such a secluded, out-of-the-way spot suggested foul play. The woman carried no identification, and there were no obvious personal documents or cell phone, only the tattered remnants of her clothing and a few mundane items. The Burlington County Medical Examiner couldn't initially determine the cause of her demise, and no significant clues were recovered. With no ID and no immediate missing person match, the case began as a perplexing Jane Doe investigation. Although her name was a mystery, investigators did gather valuable details about the unidentified woman. She was between 25 and 35 years old and stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. She weighed somewhere between 100 to 125 pounds in life, though this was just a rough estimate given the state of her remains. Her hair was black, and she likely had black or brown eyes, and she was initially believed to be half white and half Asian, though some suggested that she could be Native American. No evidence of trauma has ever been publicly disclosed, though the location of her body indicated that she was likely dumped there. While this could theoretically suggest an accidental overdose, the far more probable cause, according to investigators, was foul play. The Burlington County Jane Doe case soon went cold, as leads proved extremely elusive. Given her background, it was relatively easy to rule out missing individuals, but this didn't lead detectives to a match. She had some features that could cross ethnic categories, and as it would turn out, she would come from a background that's fairly rare in America. For years, the New Jersey State Police Cold Case Unit periodically revisited the file. They circulated a forensic sketch of the woman's face in hopes someone would recognize her, but no one ever did. Fast forward to 2025, nearly 21 years after her passing, and science finally cracked open a new avenue. Forensic specialists managed to extract a usable profile from the Jane Doe's remains after multiple earlier attempts had failed. Astria Forensics, a California-based lab, performed advanced DNA extraction and sequencing on the degraded samples, achieving a genealogy-ready profile. This genetic profile didn't end up leading to a match, but it revealed something fundamental about her. The Burlington County Jane Doe's DNA indicated that she was of Central Eurasian descent, specifically of the Turkic ethnic group. In other words, her closest genetic relatives, the very distant cousins showing up in databases, traced to populations from countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Of course, when a Jane Doe shows up with both Asian and European features, investigators never jump to the conclusion of, well, she must have been Kazakh. It suddenly made sense why no local missing persons report matched her, despite her distinctive background. She may not have originally been from the United States at all, and may have had no family or friends to report her missing. The Ramapo College of New Jersey's Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center worked with state police to determine next steps. In September 2025, they went public with the new information, hoping it might reach someone who recognizes the description. They even created a fresh outreach campaign, encouraging her sketch to be shared around Turkic community groups, both in the States and abroad. With the evidence available, several theories have emerged about the Burlington County Jane Doe's life and tragic end. One theory is that she may have been a recent immigrant or foreign national who came to New Jersey not long before her passing. Given her Central Asian ancestry, she could have moved to America for work, study, or for marriage. If so, it's possible that no local authorities were aware she was missing because her family might be overseas. Language barriers or immigration status could have prevented a timely missing persons report. Tragically, if she had few friends or contacts here, her disappearance might have gone nearly unnoticed by anyone. Another theory suggests that she may have been a tourist who was traveling solo in the United States. Some have theorized that she could have been on a tour of the entire country, and that her friends and family back home may not have known where she was when she disappeared. Without knowing where exactly she was traveling, and faced with a language barrier, there may have been no way to meaningfully report her missing. Another troubling possibility is that she was a victim of trafficking or foul play by someone she met after arriving in America. The early 2000s saw cases of trafficking rings from former Soviet states, and one of the claims is that the Jane Doe could have been caught in such a situation. Perhaps she trusted the wrong person, such as an employer, a quote-unquote boyfriend, or a smuggler, who harmed her and dumped her body behind the abandoned racetrack. The Malibu Grand Prix site, being deserted, would have been a convenient hiding place for a crime. Supporting this theory is the fact that her personal items were minimal and she was devoid of any identification, almost as if someone deliberately stripped her of anything traceable. It's easy to imagine a scenario where an assailant removed her wallet or papers to delay identification. If she was the victim of trafficking, it's been speculated that she's much less likely to be Kazakh or Azeri, rather than Kyrgyz or Uzbek. This is due to the socio-economic realities of these nations. While Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan are upper-middle-income nations, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan are quite poor, making women from these countries more likely to be targeted. A more domestic theory speculates that the woman could have been American. While individuals of her background aren't overly common in the United States, they did first start arriving in the 19th century, along with other immigrants from the Russian Empire. Some have speculated that she may actually be a Tatar, a Turkic Eurasian ethnic group found throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. Tatars often express traits from their combined European and Asian heritage, which may explain the Burlington Jane Doe's appearance and genetic results. And interestingly, while going down the rabbit hole on the presence of Tatar people in America, I found out that the iconic all-American actor Charles Bronson was half Tatar. I'm sure that'll come in handy for someone watching at a bar trivia night someday. Ultimately, at present, this Jane Doe still doesn't have her name back, but with this new piece of evidence, her case may be resolved soon. On February 14, 1975, a couple driving through rural Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana noticed something hanging amidst the trees. Stopping to investigate, they stumbled upon a tragic scene that would briefly capture national attention. At the base of the tree, they found a glass jar containing a handwritten note addressed to Mom and Dad. The boy carried no identification, and authorities would soon refer to him simply as the Plaquemines Parish John Doe. Investigators recovered the note from the jar and discovered it was a lengthy, introspective message from the boy explaining his decision. He wrote that he felt he had never truly developed into a real person, and that he was living in a false, empty existence he could no longer tolerate. The tone was one of profound despair and detachment. He described having a, quote, pervasive melancholy since birth, and believed he had stopped growing emotionally long ago. In the letter, the young man thanked his parents for all the advantages and support they had given him, but implored them not to blame themselves for what he was about to do. He even urged them to consult a psychiatrist to understand his mindset, suggesting there were aspects of his identity or mental state that he himself struggled to accept. Unusually, the note also included a section addressed to the police, and the boy pleaded with authorities not to pursue his identity. He argued that any investigation would accomplish little except to shatter his parents' peace by confirming their worst fears. In a final wish, he asked to be cremated and buried as a John Doe, so his parents could retain hope that their missing son might one day return instead of knowing he was gone forever. Essentially, this teenager tried to erase his own identity to spare his loved one's pain. The content of the note fascinated the public and investigators alike. It was extremely articulate and philosophical, far beyond what one might expect from someone who may have still been in high school. He even referenced the work of sociologist Emil Durkheim on the subject of the act he was doing, indicating he had studied some intellectual perspectives on his situation. Despite the boy's plea for anonymity, authorities couldn't simply close the case. The Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office launched an effort to identify the victim, distributing his physical description and fingerprints nationwide in hopes of matching a missing person. The Associated Press picked up the story of this mystery teen, and newspapers around the country ran articles about the unknown youth with the poignant note. Tips and leads began to flow in, as families of missing sons wondered if this could be their child. Over 300 families contacted law enforcement, and many traveled to Louisiana to view the body at a New Orleans area funeral home. Despite this extensive effort, in the end, every lead and comparison turned up empty. By June 1975, with no identification uncovered, authorities felt they had done all they could. The unknown boy was laid to rest in an unmarked grave at a cemetery in Gretna, Louisiana. His funeral was simple and anonymous, in keeping with his own wishes. After the burial, this John Doe case quickly slipped from the spotlight, becoming yet another unsolved mystery. With no actual crime to investigate, there was little incentive for officials to pursue it further. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina's devastation reportedly destroyed many local records, and the John Doe's case file and the exact location of his burial were lost. In 2022, despite the lost case file, he was finally added to the Name Us database, a repository of John and Jane Doe cases as well as missing people. With his case now on the radar, there remains hope that modern forensic techniques might provide answers eventually. However, without a known DNA sample or an exhumation, identifying him will be challenging. While it's known that he was buried in Gretna, the unfortunate reality is that no one knows exactly where he was laid to rest. While he had requested to be cremated in his note, contemporary reports indicate that this wasn't done. His remains do lay somewhere in that cemetery, though, and if someone is able to remember where he was buried, there is the potential to resolve his case once and for all. Many theories have been proposed to explain who this young man was and why he felt compelled to do what he did. Most believe that he suffered from serious depression or another mental illness that left him feeling numb and isolated. He described himself as living a detached, hollow life without real friendships. Some have speculated that this aligns with severe depression or perhaps even high-functioning autism. Another theory is that he was grappling with issues of identity. Being gay had only been removed from the psychiatric list of disorders a year earlier, in 1974, and prejudice remained extremely strong. It's speculated that he might have been very concerned about the grief this reality would have brought to his parents. His suggestion that his parents see a psychiatrist to understand what was going on with him hints that there was something fundamental about himself that he felt they didn't understand. Another theory suggests that he may have been a first-year university student living far away from home who suffered from a mental break. This could explain why he was quoting Durkheim in his letter, and the upper end of his estimated age range puts him well within the range of being a student. Another theory about who he was centers on the national attention the case received in the wake of his passing. The news articles were very clear that the John Doe really didn't want to be identified. Perhaps his parents were one of the families who came to see his body, and recognizing it was him, didn't identify him to the police. After all, the absolute last thing this young man seems to have wanted was a media circus surrounding himself, given his desire to be buried as a John Doe. Under this theory, his parents quietly made their peace, and fearing the national attention that would be brought by his identification, chose to respect his wishes. And I can see why they may have done this. And after all, identifying him wouldn't have brought him back, and no crime was committed that they needed to get justice for their son. In a tragic irony, the young man achieved his wish to remain a nameless enigma, but paradoxically, this status has since captured the hearts and minds of millions of people. I can relate to that in a huge way, since I had previously very briefly covered his story last year. It was just a very short segment, just about 2 minutes, and I couldn't get his story out of my mind. Every few months since that point, I've gone back and looked to see if there was any breakthroughs in his case. And honestly, I'm gonna keep doing that. Perhaps one day we'll know who he was and why he did what he did, but for now, his story will remain one of the most compelling and heartbreaking John Doe cases I've covered. In the bitter Chicago winter of December 1978, the air around 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was thick with more than just frost. For years, neighbors had complained about a foul smell they couldn't place. Now they knew why. Inside the quiet suburban home, investigators were engaged in a methodical, grim excavation trying to find remains. One by one, they emerged from the cramped crawl space, the forgotten sons, brothers, and friends who had vanished into the orbit of John Wayne Gacy. As the count climbed to a staggering 33, a second, more enduring tragedy came into focus. While some victims were quickly identified by wallets left in their pockets or by dental records, many were just skeletons, their identities seemingly erased forever. They were assigned numbers, cold designations for an unspeakable horror. This is the story of one of them, the young man known only as victim number 28, a boy who disappeared in the earliest days of Gacy's reign of terror. John Wayne Gacy was a master of the double life. In public, he was a pillar of his Norwood Park community. He was a successful contractor running his own business, an active Democratic precinct captain, and a friendly neighbor known for hosting lively parties. He was perhaps most famous for his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, performing at children's parties and charity events. This respectable facade was the perfect cover for the monster beneath. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured at least 33 boys and young men, ranging in age from 14 to 21, to his home. His method was a horrifyingly consistent pattern of predation. He targeted vulnerable youths, hitchhikers, runaways, boys and young men he met at bus stations, or those simply looking for a job at his construction company. Once they were at his house, he'd often use alcohol or drugs to lower their inhibitions before introducing his quote-unquote magic trick. This was a ruse that involved convincing them to put on handcuffs. Little did his victims know that once the cuffs were on, Gacy's true evil nature emerged. From there, he would commit unspeakable acts before slaying them, usually by strangulation. He buried 29 of his victims on his property, most of them crammed into the crawl space, and dumped the last 4 in a nearby river. For 6 years, his spree went unchecked, aided by a system that often dismissed the concerns of frantic parents. It wasn't until the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast in December 1978 that a determined police investigation finally led to Gacy's door. With this, the authorities would unearth the very literal graveyard he had built beneath his very own home. Pulled from the earth, Victim 28 was little more than a collection of bones and unanswered questions. Forensic analysis provided a sparse but crucial profile. He was a white male, between 14 and 18 years old at the time of his death, and stood somewhere between 5 feet 6 and 5 foot 11. But the most significant clue was the time frame investigators assigned to his disappearance, sometime between January 3rd, 1972, and July 31st, 1975. This places this slaying squarely in the nascent phase of Gacy's career as a predator. Gacy's first known slaying, that of 16-year-old Timothy McCoy, occurred on January 3rd, 1972. By the end of 1975, he had slain only 2 other known victims. The vast majority of his offenses, at least 30 of them, were committed after his second divorce in March 1976, when he was living alone and completely unconstrained. This early time frame is profoundly important because it means Victim 28 was slain, while Gacy was still married to and living with his second wife, Carol Hoff. She was aware of the terrible smell coming from the crawl space, a stench Gacy explained away as moisture from a sewer pipe, which he attempted to mask with layers of lime and concrete. This context suggests that the attack on Victim 28 had to be carried out with a greater degree of stealth than Gacy's later, more frenzied slaughter. The victim was likely someone Gacy could plausibly bring home without raising suspicion. Some investigators believe he was a runaway that was offered a job with Gacy's contracting company, a profile that fits many of his victims. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, identifying the victims was a monumental task limited by the technology of the era. Given the state of the remains, investigators relied heavily on dental records and matching X-ray records to old healed fractures on the bones. They also relied on personal effects found in Gacy's house that also led to names. But these methods were only as good as the records available, and for many families, such records were lost or non-existent. For decades, 8 of Gacy's victims remained nameless. Then, in 2011, the Cook County Sheriff reopened the cold case, determined to use modern science to finish the job his predecessors couldn't. Investigators exhumed the remains of the 8 unidentified victims to extract DNA. The effort yielded immediate, incredible results, and a number of the unknown victims were quickly identified. Unfortunately, Victim 28 wasn't identified through this method, and his genetic information didn't match any known missing person reported. Synthesizing the evidence as we know it, there's a few things we can say about who this missing person was. Critically, it's almost certain he was never reported missing, or if he was, the report was lost to time or jurisdictional gaps. 2 primary theories have emerged from this. He could have been a local youth, estranged from his family due to the kind of dysfunction that might prevent a missing person report from being filed promptly, if at all. Or, like Gacy's first victim, Timothy McCoy, he could have been a traveler, a hitchhiker, or a runaway just passing through Chicago from another state. In a pre-digital world, connecting a boy who vanished in Illinois to a family searching for him in Ohio or California was a near impossible task. This young man's anonymity was his greatest vulnerability. While later victims had families who grew suspicious of Gacy and hounded the police, Victim 28 disappeared without a ripple, making him the perfect prey from Gacy's perspective. In essence, His complete disconnect from any social safety net is the very reason his case remains one of the hardest to solve. The most recent breakthrough in the case came from a revolutionary new field, forensic genetic genealogy, which I believe I've mentioned on my channel once or twice. In 2021, this method was used to identify victim 5 as Francis Wayne Alexander, a young man from North Carolina who had recently moved to Chicago. The search for the identity of victim 28 and the 4 other nameless boys remains extremely important despite Gacy having been eliminated Old Yeller style in 1994. Identifying this victim, as well as the other 4, is a refusal to let one of history's worst serial predators have the final word. On a December morning in 1991, a hiker in Florida's Seminole State Forest followed drag marks off a trail and found what he first thought was a discarded mannequin's leg. When he got a little bit closer, he realized that he had found the victim of a horrific crime. This person, later nicknamed the Lake County Jane Doe by the authorities, had been subject to the worst forms of assault and then eliminated. Disturbingly, while the perpetrator was theoretically brought to justice, to this day, no one knows her identity. On December 7, 1991, the woman's body was found partially buried under tree branches in a wooded area about 75 yards off a road in Sorrento, Lake County, Florida. The perp had attempted to conceal her with brush, and the brutality of the attack was evident from her injuries. Indeed, evidence suggested this monster had even stabbed her in the neck with a broken glass bottle, in addition to strangling her. The remote location and lack of any identification made the investigation difficult from the start, leaving authorities with a tragic crime, but no name for the victim and no immediate suspects. Police determined that the Jane Doe was a white female likely between about 25 and 40 years old. She stood around 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed roughly 125 pounds, with shoulder-length brown hair that bleached blonde at the ends and hazel eyes. Medical examination showed she had given birth to at least one child in her life. There was also coke found in her system, and investigators noted her legs were particularly muscular. This led to speculation that she might have worked as a dancer in an adult club, or that she may have been a former athlete. When discovered, she was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt, a white blouse, and a single white sock. A distinctive piece of jewelry was found with her, a gold dangling earring featuring stars and hearts. Also, heads up, if you're one of those people who just watches, I've put this earring up on screen. Unfortunately, I could only find a black and white photograph of this earring, but I figured it was worth showing anyway, given how unique it looks. Detectives hoped that this unusual earring or details like her prior orthodontic dental work might trigger someone's memory, but no matches turned up in any missing person reports. Her fingerprints and later her DNA were entered into national databases, yet nothing led to an identification in those early years. For several years, the case stagnated with no leads on the victim's name or the perpetrator. The breakthrough came in 1995, thanks to forensic DNA technology that was just beginning to revolutionize cold cases. Biological material recovered from the crime scene had been preserved and analyzed, and in February 1995, it produced a match in Florida's then-new DNA database. The profile identified Joseph Algernon Roll, a 29-year-old local man from the Sorrento area. Roll was a convict with a history of violent attacks that fit the profile of what was done to the Jane Doe, which immediately made him the prime suspect. In fact, he had recently served a short prison term for a 1992 essay and was known for a pattern of choking or threatening his victims. At the time, using a DNA databank to crack a case was cutting edge, and Florida's database contained only a few thousand profiles. This hit was considered a major stroke of luck and a landmark moment for the investigation. The Lake County Jane Doe became one of the first cases in the state solved by a DNA match to a convicted offender. After DNA tied Roll to the crime, he was arrested and charged with the offense against the unknown woman. In 1996, he faced a jury trial in Lake County. The DNA evidence firmly placed him at the scene and proved what he had done. Prosecutors also attempted to introduce testimony from two other women who said Roll had committed horrific acts to them in the past, highlighting his violent modus operandi. The jury ultimately found Roll guilty of the indecent assault, but lacking certainty that he was the one who committed the actual slaying, they acquitted him of that charge. Despite that split verdict, the judge delivered a severe sentence. Citing Roll's dangerous history, the court gave him life in prison for the conviction. To this day, Roll maintains that he didn't know the victim beyond what he claims was a consensual encounter. Thankfully, he remains behind bars for life, ensuring no further harm can be done. With the likely perpetrator locked up, investigators never lost sight of the remaining question of who this Jane Doe is. In 2025, the authorities confirmed that her case was sent out for genetic genealogical testing, which ought to provide some further answers about her identity. It's not every day you see someone dancing in the middle of a freeway. Yet on one September afternoon in 1992, drivers in Port Hueneme, California encountered exactly that. A young woman twirling on a road's median as cars whizzed by. A concerned motorist stopped and took her to a nearby police station for help. There, the mystery deepened. The woman couldn't speak or understand the officers. She responded only with blank looks and gestures. She had no identification, only a bank receipt from San Diego that led nowhere. After hours of fruitless questioning, police had no choice but to release her back to the street. For all intents and purposes, this unidentified young woman was alone in the world, seemingly abandoned by whoever had once looked after her. Remarkably, the very next day, the same woman was found wandering again, looking just as confused. And I just realized I wrote remarkably in my script for perhaps one of the most unremarkable things to ever have occurred. What did they honestly think was going to happen to this woman by just tossing her out onto the street like that? This time, authorities placed her in a women's shelter rather than leaving her on her own. Shelter staff quickly realized she couldn't tell them her name or story. They were struck by how profoundly isolated her world was, since she could neither read, write, nor speak in any normal way. She relied on improvised sign-like motions and even scribbled gibberish when given a pen. A communication specialist was brought in and managed to get her to spell out something resembling Lucy. The name was spelled Luxci, which they pronounced as Lucy since it was the closest name they knew that looked vaguely like that. When shown these letters written down, the woman smiled and reacted with delight, so they began calling her that for lack of any other name. Over the next few weeks, patient efforts yielded a few fragments of Lucy's history. She indicated through gestures that she was 23 years old. She also signaled that she had arrived in California on an airplane and that she'd had a baby who was no longer with her. Doctors confirmed she had given birth not long before she was found, backing up her claim about a lost child. Staff observed that Lucy kept herself clean and followed basic daily routines, suggesting she had been cared for by someone until relatively recently. She even wore a ring with the letter S on it, possibly indicating the name of her missing baby. Despite these clues, however, extensive checks of missing person reports and databases found no one who matched Lucy's description. In early 1993, her plight was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries in hopes that a viewer might recognize her, but no useful leads emerged. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, with no paper trail or past anyone could find. By late 1992, With her identity still unknown, Lucy was moved to a residential home for developmentally disabled adults who needed full-time care. There, a startling discovery was made. Lucy wasn't actually fully deaf as had been believed. In one incident, a balloon popped and she visibly flinched, leading to formal hearing tests which showed she could hear relatively normally. Her muteness and strange communication were attributed instead to cognitive impairments and a lack of language development during childhood. Essentially, although she was in her 20s, she functioned at the level of a young child in terms of communication ability. This, along with the lack of records of her existence, paints the image of her having a child in an extremely sinister light. For a few months, Lucy stayed under supervised care, but in mid-1993, she ran away from the care home and vanished once again. That winter, in December 1993, a breakthrough of sorts occurred in an unlikely place, Cotati, a small town in Northern California. Police there found a mute, confused homeless woman sleeping on a sidewalk and realized it was Lucy, now nearly 400 miles from where she had first been discovered. How she got there remains unclear. When found in Cotati, she was carrying a small amount of meth, so authorities held her briefly while trying to find her identity. The renewed publicity led to many calls and tips from the public, yet still no one could positively identify her. Authorities marveled that someone so impaired could survive largely on her own. After being released from custody, Lucy slipped away again, disappearing from official records. In the years that followed, unconfirmed sightings of Lucy continued to surface. According to some local reports, she was seen around Ventura County, for example in Santa Paula, as late as 2014, living among homeless communities. Witnesses noted her habit of pushing a cart of belongings and communicating mostly with grunts or gestures. These accounts, however, were never verified, and officially the trail has gone cold. Personally, I question whether these later sightings were actually her, given that I find it difficult that she could have made it on her own for that length of time given her level of disability. Many theories have been proposed over the years to explain who Lucy might be and how she ended up in such tragic circumstances. Given the hints that Lucy had a baby taken from her and her apparent wariness around men, some suspect she was a victim of trafficking. In this scenario, she may have come from another country, perhaps in Latin America. Under this theory, she may have been trafficked when she was very young, which may explain why she never developed language abilities. Unfortunately, I think this may be the tragic and disturbing reality of Lucy's case. Another theory is that Lucy was the dependent of a family who became unable to care for her, or that may have been subjecting her to horrific acts. She may have had developmental disabilities from birth, and her family could have kept her at home under lock and key. The case of Lucy remains a haunting, unsolved mystery. She is essentially an unidentified person who was found alive yet never linked to any known identity or family. Despite national media exposure and exhaustive efforts by authorities, her real name and background were never discovered. Notably, it's unclear if there are any genetic samples from Lucy preserved, but if there are, she may one day be identified. Unfortunately, though, whatever the case, Lucy slipped through the cracks of the system and likely ended up living on the streets the rest of her days. However, if it's true that her family was involved in the disturbing treatment she evidently received, there may be some quantum of justice for Lucy coming one day. On a chilly day in February 1971, two hitchhikers traveling along Interstate 75 in Central Florida made a gruesome discovery beneath the Lake Panasoffkee overpass. In the shallow waters of Shady Brook Creek beneath that bridge lay the body of a young woman, badly decomposed after roughly a month in the water. A man's leather belt was still wrapped around her neck, and it appeared her body had been bundled up and dropped from the overpass into the marsh below. With no identification on the victim, authorities dubbed her Little Miss Lake Panisovsky, after the nearby lake. For more than half a century, that nickname was all anyone knew her by, as law enforcement struggled to uncover her identity until now. Local law enforcement in Sumter County started investigating immediately, but identifying the victim proved difficult with 1971's limited forensic tools. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, small in stature with dark hair and brown eyes. She was found wearing distinctive green clothing, plaid pants, a matching shirt, and a floral patterned shawl, along with a gold necklace, a ring, and a Baylor wristwatch. These details were carefully recorded, and police circulated descriptions nationwide, yet no missing person report matched the victim. An autopsy confirmed she had been strangled with the belt, likely weeks before her discovery. Heartbreakingly, examiners also determined that the young woman had given birth to children in the past. Somewhere, it seemed, she had family who didn't know what had become of her. Despite extensive effort, the early investigation yielded no leads. The unknown woman was laid to rest in a local cemetery as a Jane Doe, her grave marker bearing the placeholder name that the community had given her. Over the next several decades, investigators refused to let the Little Miss Lake Panisovsky case be forgotten. In 1986, her remains were exhumed to take advantage of improved forensic techniques. Specialists re-examined her bones and teeth, confirming the victim's general profile and noting signs of prior medical care, such as dental work and a healed ankle surgery. Critically, they reaffirmed that she had given birth to at least 2 children, a clue that could have narrowed searches, yet still no identity was found. In 1992, the case was featured on the show Unsolved Mysteries, bringing national attention to the story. For those of you who are unaware of what a cultural phenomenon this show was at the time, the first run of an episode would be watched by 10 million households in North America. Tips came in and police compared countless missing persons cases, but no match emerged. Incredibly, at least one family member watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode without realizing it was about their missing relative. In 2006, they submitted the victim's fingerprints to the FBI's national database, hoping she might have a record, but no hits turned up at the time. By the late 2000s, the team turned to advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, her DNA was in poor condition and produced no useful matches. One scientific analysis even suggested the victim may have spent her childhood in Greece, based on isotope clues in her remains. This led investigators down a frustrating false trail, theorizing she could have been a recent immigrant. Despite all these efforts, the young woman's name remained unknown as the case approached its 55th year. Then the breakthrough finally came in 2025, not from genetic genealogy, but from fingerprints. The Sumter County Sheriff's Office had acquired a cutting-edge fingerprint matching system that uses artificial intelligence to compare degraded fingerprints to complete copies. In October 2025, the system returned a stunning result, a match to fingerprints from a 1970 arrest in Hillsborough County, Florida. After 54 years, Little Miss Lake Panisovsky suddenly had a name. The arrest record identified her as Cookie Rowan, who had been booked in 1970 on a minor charge involving a bad check. Investigators quickly confirmed that the fingerprints and all other details matched the long unidentified victim. In late October 2025, Sheriff Patrick Breeden announced that the mystery of her identity was solved. At a press conference, Sheriff Breeden declared that Little Miss Lake Panisovsky finally had a name, as he revealed Cookie's identity to the world. It was a triumphant and emotional moment for the cold case team and the community. Cookie Rowan turned out to be a 21-year-old local woman and mother, and hadn't grown up in Greece. Tellingly, she had never even been reported missing back in 1971, a fact that helps explain why identification was so difficult. Ironically, the key to identifying her had been in law enforcement files for years. Her fingerprints were uploaded to the FBI database in 2013, long after the initial search. However, until this new cutting-edge technology could compare the degraded fingerprint from her body to the perfect print taken by the cops, the connection couldn't be made. And honestly, it's kind of interesting to see ultra-high-tech forensic solutions that don't involve forensic genetic genealogy once in a while. Once her identity was confirmed, a fuller picture of Cookie Rowan emerged. She was born and raised in the United States and had never even been to Greece, proving that isotope analysis can be problematic. By age 21, Cookie was the mother of 2 young children. She lived in the Tampa area and had married Charles Emery Rowan. However, Cookie's personal life was troubled. Her marriage was reportedly tumultuous, and she had separated from her husband shortly before she disappeared. The exact circumstances around her disappearance are still hazy. Those close to her may not have realized she was truly missing, and some have speculated that a narrative may have been spun by the perpetrator that she abandoned her children. Her now grown children and other relatives finally learned what happened to their long-lost mother. In a public statement, the family expressed deep gratitude to the investigators and the community who never gave up. Identifying Cookie answered the biggest question in the Lake Panasoffkee case, but the mystery isn't entirely over. Investigators also identified a person of interest in her slaying: her estranged husband, Charles Emery Rowan. Emery Rowan would have been 85 years old in 2025, and he died in 2015, taking any secrets he had to the grave. While he can never be formally charged or interrogated, detectives suspect he may have been involved in Cookie's death given the circumstances and their history together. The case remains open as an active investigation, with authorities continuing to gather information about Cookie's final days and anyone who might have been responsible. Personally, I hope the authorities keep digging on this one, since while there is an incredibly obvious suspect, the details of her disappearance are presently unknown. For instance, it's always possible that Cookie had entered into a new relationship after the separation, and this completely unknown person may be responsible. That said, though, I think the most obvious explanation is likely that her former spouse did it and then claimed she left the state and abandoned her children. This may be why her own family members never ended up bringing her case to the authorities. In October 1985, a highway mowing crew in Smith County, Texas, made a gruesome discovery. Human skeletal remains hidden in a brushy gully beside Interstate 20. The victim was an unidentified young woman, and for almost 40 years, her name and story remained unknown. Today, we know that she was Gina Crow, a 27-year-old new mother from Arlington who vanished in 1984 and became the center of a decades-long mystery. Gina was a young Texas mother with an extremely tumultuous personal life. By 1984, at age 26, she had been through multiple marriages, the latest in January 1984 to a man named Dwight Crow. That summer, she gave birth to a daughter in July 1984, but not long after, Gina vanished without a trace. Because her family lived out of state and didn't even know about her new marriage or baby, no one reported Gina missing when she disappeared in late 1984. In the wake of her disappearance, Gina's husband, Dwight, told people that his wife had left voluntarily and cut off contact. He even sent their infant daughter to live with Gina's relatives in Alabama, as he claimed he couldn't care for the baby alone. With Gina's family initially unaware of any potential foul play and no police inquiry, her absence flew under the radar. It would be many months before the truth of her fate began to surface. On October 1st, 1985, more than a year after Gina's disappearance, a Texas highway work crew made a grim discovery in Smith County. While mowing brush along Interstate 20 near the Highway 69 exit, workers stumbled upon human skeletal remains in a gully about 75 feet from the road. Scattered near the bones was a pile of clothing, a yellow shirt emblazoned with Top Rail Country Music Dallas, Texas, which turned out to be a souvenir from a local bar. She also had a gold butterfly earring and a gold wristwatch were also found in the dirt nearby. Investigators determined the victim was a young woman, and it appeared someone had tried to deliberately hide her body under the brush. Based on the condition of the remains, they estimated she had been dead for about 12 to 15 months, placing her death in the latter half of 1984. This timeline aligned eerily with the period when Gina Crow went missing. While the autopsy couldn't reveal the cause of death, the location in which her body was discovered meant it was investigated as a homicide. For decades, the case remained unsolved and the young woman remained unidentified. No one had realized that the missing Gina Crow and this Jane Doe were the same person, since Gina was never reported missing to authorities. Furthermore, Gina had been living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, whereas the remains turned up in East Texas, making the link even harder to recognize. Gina's family was left with painful questions. Her father even speculated that because she often hitchhiked, she might have been picked up by a serial predator like Ted Bundy. By 2021, with the trail long cold, the sheriff's office finally tried a new approach, enlisting the DNA Doe Project to help put a name to their Jane Doe. Specialists managed to extract a DNA profile from the old skeletal remains and uploaded it to genealogy databases. By late 2023, their research pointed to a missing woman named Gina Crow. Detectives soon tracked down Gina Crow's relatives, her mother in Fort Worth and her now adult daughter in Alabama, and obtained their DNA. As a result of these efforts, the sheriff's office announced the identification in April 2024, restoring Gina's name nearly 40 years after she vanished. Even with Gina's identity known, the mystery of her death remains. No definitive cause of death could be determined, but investigators believe she was undoubtedly killed and her body dumped to hide the crime. Naturally, suspicion centers on the person closest to her at the time, her husband, Dwight Crow. He had a history of heavy drinking, and there are allegations that he engaged in violence towards her. Further, when Gina vanished, he claimed she left on her own. Dwight never reported Gina missing, and his behavior struck her family as highly suspicious. Although Dwight is now deceased, one investigator on the case has stated he believes Dwight was likely responsible for Gina's death. If that is true, Dwight escaped justice, but the investigation remains open. Also, just a quick strange footnote on the case. Gina had previously been married to a convicted serial killer named Larry Keith Robinson. While he was permanently locked up at the time of her death, investigators have considered whether he used his contacts on the outside to orchestrate the event. Personally, I think this is much less likely than her husband having done it, but ultimately, this is an avenue that investigators are going down. April 8th, 1988. Along the Lake Michigan shoreline near New Buffalo, Michigan, authorities recovered the remains of an unidentified woman. To local investigators, she became known only as the New Buffalo Jane Doe, a mysterious victim with no name and an uncertain fate. For nearly 4 decades, the identity of this woman and the story of what happened to her remained a haunting puzzle. Today, we know that the woman found that day was Dorothy Glanton, a 71-year-old Chicago resident who had vanished months earlier. For decades, both her family and the police wondered who she was and how she ended up in the lake, until cutting-edge science finally provided answers, though not the full story. Dorothy Glanton was a 71-year-old resident of Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood in 1987. Born in Alabama and raised in Chicago from the 1920s onward, her family moved north during the Great Migration, and Dorothy had very deep roots in her community. On December 9, 1987, she left her home on South Prairie Avenue, telling a family member she was headed to a local drugstore and would be back soon. It was a routine errand on an ordinary day, but Dorothy never returned home. Concerned relatives reported her missing to Chicago police that very evening. Officers and family members combed the neighborhood and checked local hospitals and shelters, but no trace of Dorothy was found. In the weeks that followed, her family frantically searched and even took out newspaper ads pleading for Dorothy to contact them. 4 months after Dorothy's disappearance, an unsettling discovery took place far from her neighborhood. On April 8, 1988, near the shoreline of Lake Michigan by New Buffalo, a passerby spotted a woman's body floating in the water. Police were called, and the remains of a female were pulled from the lake. The body was decomposed after months in the water, making visual identification impossible. Investigators carefully noted the unknown woman's features and clothing for clues. She had brown hair and was found dressed in men's blue jeans with a striped belt, a pair of shorts and pantyhose underneath, and black ankle boots. These odd details gave police some hints about the woman's appearance and attire, but nothing that immediately revealed who she was. An autopsy provided a few more insights. The Jane Doe had a long surgical scar on her abdomen and evidence of a past hysterectomy. She also had extensive dental work, including a porcelain dental bridge on a front tooth and gold crowns, indicating she'd received high-quality dental care in recent years. The examiner noted her teeth were in good condition with little staining, suggesting she didn't smoke or drink. These clues implied the unknown woman might have been older and of a relatively affluent background in life. Still, nothing in her physical description or medical history was distinctive enough to match her to a name. With no identification on the body and no immediate matches to missing person reports, authorities were left stumped. Unable to identify the body, Michigan authorities treated the case as a Jane Doe investigation. Based on the state of the remains, police initially assumed the victim was a white woman in her 40s or 50s. This erroneous profile sent investigators down the wrong path. They compared the Jane Doe's description against missing persons cases from around the region, but none fit the limited details they had. Investigators even entered the case into national missing persons databases to seek a match, but nothing turned up. Despite these efforts, no leads emerged and the trail went cold, likely because Dorothy was an elderly black woman, not a middle-aged white woman. Meanwhile, Dorothy Glanton's family in Chicago heard nothing about the body in New Buffalo. They continued to search for Dorothy in the Chicago area, utterly unaware that she had already been found deceased across state lines. The newspaper plea they published in August 1988, imploring Dorothy to come home as soon as possible, received no answer. For decades, the New Buffalo Jane Doe lay buried without a name in a Benton Harbor cemetery, and Dorothy's family had no closure, and it seemed like a hopeless mystery. In 2021, Michigan State Police decided to reopen the investigation into the New Buffalo Jane Doe. Detectives had the unknown woman's remains exhumed to obtain DNA samples for advanced testing. Using modern forensic technology, they developed a DNA profile and in 2023 enlisted the help of the DNA Doe Project. Before long, the DNA results yielded a surprise that corrected the old assumptions. The genetic data revealed that the Jane Doe was actually an African-American woman in her 70s, not a middle-aged white woman as previously believed. At one point, the genealogy team even wondered if the unidentified remains might belong to a daughter of Dorothy Glanton, due to the age confusion. They soon realized the supposed daughter never existed. The Jane Doe was in fact Dorothy herself. Armed with this new understanding, researchers homed in on a family originally from Alabama and a woman who had moved to Chicago as a child. By comparing the Jane Doe's DNA with Dorothy's relatives, investigators finally confirmed that the unidentified remains belonged to Dorothy Glanton. In November 2025, nearly 38 years after Dorothy disappeared, the Michigan State Police announced that the new Buffalo Jane Doe had been positively identified. At long last, the nameless victim had a name. This development brought a bittersweet sense of relief. Dorothy's surviving family members, after so many years of wondering, finally learned her fate and could hold a proper remembrance for her. Now that Dorothy has been identified, one big question remains. How did she end up in Lake Michigan so far from home? The autopsy back in 1988 suggested that drowning was the likely cause of death, but investigators couldn't determine whether her drowning was accidental, self-inflicted, or the result of foul play. One theory that's currently being considered is that she slipped and fell accidentally into the water. However, no one seems to explain how she ended up in New Buffalo to begin with, which adds a great deal of uncertainty to this theory. As you'll recall, she informed her family member that she was just quickly running out to the pharmacist and would be back shortly. Personally, I suspect that foul play must have been involved here, though at present there's just not enough evidence to say if this is the case conclusively. The cold waters of Lake Michigan still hold the secrets of what happened to Dorothy, but at least they no longer hold her identity.